Okay, so we are good. Then a warm welcome from my side to this Oasis conference here in Rüschlikon. Warm welcome to everybody here in the room, and also a warm welcome to those being here online. So we have really a setup where we have a part of it here, of the crowd here in the room, and the rest is virtual on Teams. I hope all of you can hear me well. My name is Aeberhardt. I'm heading the Cat Paris R&D team at Swiss Re, and together with Dickie, I will be the co-host for today's conference. To begin with a few housekeeping rules. So for those online, please make sure that you're always muted. You can turn on your camera anytime. It would be great to see your faces. If you have questions, raise your hand and we're going to unmute you and put you here on screen, and then the audience can see and hear you. For those here in the room, please stick as well to our COVID rules that we have. Means whenever you walk around, please wear a mask. Once you're seated, you can turn off your mask and enjoy. We have then also networking break, roughly 3:15. It depends a bit on how quickly we move forward. Where we have then coffee outside. To walk there, please again wear masks, and once you're seated, you can turn off the mask. I think that's it in terms of housekeeping right now. Then I would like to hand over to Dickie, that we can actually start with the conference. Thank you.
Beat, thank you very, very much to everybody here. Welcome. It's brilliant to actually be in a conference after many of us, of course, have not had this experience. And fantastic as well to have the people online. Maybe the best of both worlds. We'll have to see. So I just want to maybe set the stage a little bit for why does any of this matter, and why are we having this conversation here in Zurich? And I would like to suggest that actually there are three key things that every senior executive in the insurance and reinsurance industry needs to focus on. So the first one is costs and efficiency. So it's hard, I think, for anybody in this room or virtually online not to feel the issue around price and how that actually affects our day-to-day activity. If you look at our industry generally, around the world, cost base is something like 40%, up to 40% of the premium goes towards operational costs. I mean, that's a big number. I've tried to find out how it compares with other industries, and from what I can see, the only industry in the world that has a higher cost base is the banking industry. I'm not sure that's a good organizational structure to have as a comparison for us. Or another way of looking at it is approximately on average 70% of any insurance or reinsurance company's profit actually is expenses. So if you think about that, if we can change those operational costs, we can become a much more efficient business. And that's what's the first set of speakers are going to talk a little bit about how they are operationalizing Oasis to ultimately both reduce costs and in fact also to increase choice. The second set of speakers are going to talk about what happens if we don't do that, or potentially how we're going to be enabled to do this better. So it's going to focus on what type of transformation could the insurance industry go through itself to be able to be more effective and more customer focused. And I am sure, because you're going to hear from at least one of them today, that the insurance industry is going to be doing that. That's great. But of course, if we don't, then somebody else will do it. And I think as an industry, we need to think about whether or not we want to be somebody that enables our own transformation, if you like, a Netflix, who did that so well a few years ago, or an industry, or a company, an industry that didn't do it, like Kodak, that failed to be able to transform itself and was taken over and consumed by the digital industry that eventually killed it off. So that's the second set. And then I think we're going to see the third main issue, my third theme, I think, that affects us all, is about understanding risk. And there was a thing this morning in my inbox, a quotation, which I must try and get the company's name right because I got it wrong earlier today, A.M. Best said today that understanding, or the models that help us understand risk, are becoming less important in the pricing function. I mean, wow, that's a pretty big statement to make to a group of people that are listening here today that's main job is understanding risk. And I think the reason for that, of course, is, are we really being served as well as we could do by the immense expertise that lies in academia on, for example, climate change? And I think the answer is probably not. So the panel that deals with that is going to be examining whether or not there are better ways of solving that problem. To what extent can academia help us more quickly understand how to deal with climate change? And then in between that, we've got a session from the Insurance Development Forum with Nick Moody, who is going to be talking a little bit about how the standardization that Oasis has rolled out around the world is going to be helping for developing countries. But actually the point is, of course, it's not just for developing countries, that the value of that standardization should be applicable to everybody online and in this room. So what I hope is that you get out of today is something that shows how in the 10 years since we started Oasis, it's ready for you to be able to help with cutting costs, enabling transformation, understanding risk, because ultimately each of you here in Zurich or online has a choice you may make, as we all do. And the choice is, do we want to be part of the problem that has existed for a number of years, or part of the solution that we need to move to be able to be better and more profitable companies and units? So fantastic to see you all here. Beat.
Good. Thank you, Dickie. So before we start with the first session, I would like to give you a few insights why for Swiss Re Oasis is important and what we're actually doing around Oasis. We get there. So first part is about acceleration of Oasis. There was earlier this year some large players in the insurance industry gathered together to actually further accelerate Oasis, to collect more money for Oasis, to bring it to the next level. Here we called it enterprise level, but it's actually already today on an enterprise level. That's an important point, as Dickie mentioned before. It's more bring it even to the next level, because there are already a lot of companies using it on an enterprise level. And with those funds that have been collected earlier this year, we make sure that Oasis will sustain also over a longer time. So that is one important announcement that went out this year earlier, and where a lot of companies, you see them, have supported, among others, also Swiss Re. So from that point of view, it's very important for Swiss Re. Along with that announcement, we also had a lot of backing, also from senior management. Just wanted to show you here a quote from our Chief Underwriting Officer, Thierry Léger, who was actually quoting how important, what he thinks about Oasis, how does he see Oasis and why it's important. Topics like interoperability, collaboration, diversity of risk, those are really topics that are close to our modeling strategy, and therefore Oasis is a very good fit for Swiss Re. That shows also really the acceleration that happened around Oasis. I think now, as of today, there are like more than 20 companies that actually provide models in an Oasis format. There are more than 100 models out there that can be licensed directly by the model providers. There are companies that use Oasis internally for their entire modeling framework. There are companies that provide solutions based on Oasis, like NASDAQ, Complex, Exceedance, impact forecasting. There are a lot of companies that really build on Oasis, and we see there much more going on. Beside the technical part, that community part is very important. Oh, it's those kind of events as we have it today, but also the connections that we get via Oasis. That is also for Swiss Re very important. An important part or an outcome that we just were able to announce earlier this week is a collaboration on earthquake modeling together with GEM. Some major players like Hannover Re, Partner Re, Guy Carpenter, the NTU from Singapore and Swiss Re will jointly build CAT models based on GEM's background. support GEM to actually provide commercial models. And here the announcement just went out this Tuesday and is publicly also available on the GEM site. That just shows joining forces. That's also a very important topic around Oasis, and that's also one of the reasons why Swiss Re is investing there. Lastly is also the technical part. There I quickly want to explain three main areas where Swiss Re is investing. On one hand side, integrating Oasis into our modeling platform to digest third-party models. That's kind of the first part, where you will also hear much more later on from Andreas Zbinden. The other part is about exposure and result data standards. So it's about consuming OED, it's about shaping OED, being there part of those working groups to actually move that data standard forward and use that in our underwriting frameworks. The last part, that's building own models based on Oasis rating kernel or Oasis framework. That's something we are working on, and the recent example with the GEM model collaboration is exactly something where we build a model jointly with somebody, with a third party, and then consume that model within our underwriting frameworks. More on the details you will hear in the next session. And with that, I would like to hand over to Simos for the part to explain us how Guy Carpenter actually uses Oasis and what they are doing on Guy Carpenter's side.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm going to talk to you about how in GC we are using Oasis. And you will see we are really heavy users of Oasis. We use it operationally. We have 4 environments, 6 calculation engines. There are more than 50 CAD modelers that are using the system, and we are running more than 100 analyses per week. So if I'm going just a bit on the detail, here is our setup. When we get exposure data, the first thing to do is to convert them to OED format. And then before entering the Oasis platform that we have, we need to import them to the OPT, the Oasis processing tool. That is in order to disaggregate, validate the results, because we have models with different construction types, and we want to make sure that they are appropriate to be consumed by Oasis. And also one important thing that a lot of people are not really paying focus on it is the number of samples in order to make sure that we get converged results. So this tool, whenever you have entering an exposure based on the model, and the exposure will tell you how many number of samples you need to run in order to get results that are converged. As you probably know, we are collaborating with NASDAQ. We have an AWS system that is hosted by NASDAQ, an RMC, and we have also in our GC own Azure cloud the previous version of NASDAQ, the Modex internal environment. We have more than 30 GCAD models, and we are building more, in fact, all the time. And we also have 30-party models. I will tell you a bit later about that. In terms of results, we are using the results of Oasis. At the moment, it's CSV data. And then they go again to our Oasis processing tool in order to convert them, in order to be able to consume by MetaRisk, which is our risk management platform. So what are the benefits of Oasis for us? The main thing is that it gives us access with not a lot of effort to many other providers. So at the moment in our environment, we have CAT risk solutions models, we have JBA models, we have the GEM models as well, and of course our own Guy Carpenter models. Also, it is becoming an industry standard for model development. And that's because it is flexible, first of all. So we are able to build models for all kinds of perils, wind, flood, subsidence, earthquake. It's also scalable. We can build heavy models with hundreds of gigabytes of data. It's easy to share models, of course. That's very, very flexible for us. And also, we have standardized all the model development environment, so we can build models very well and in an automated way. And what is also very important, and sometimes it's overlooked, is the simulation approach of Oasis. It's very important because it doesn't take any approximations in the calculation in the damage distributions or the loss the event loss distributions or the frequency distributions. So this means that the calculation is done accurately, especially in terms of uncertainty. And this is something that we really want for our models. Finally, in terms of open data standards, in GC, we are using OED as our main model data standard. And as soon as ORD will be released, we're going to incorporate as well. And we are building a lot of tools around it, and we will continue to build a lot of tools around it. And it's very, very useful, of course, as you probably all know, because we can easily share exposure data and result data with our clients. That's it for me. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. Warm welcome from my side as well. Thank you for being able to speak to you. I want to give you a status update on where we are in our journey to integrate Oasis in our modeling platform. So we started a while ago, so it's really a status update. For those who have seen it before, for the others, it's Swiss has a bit of a unique setup, probably compared to some or most other reinsurers or insurance companies. So we have our own risk view based on a worldwide suite of proprietary catastrophe models. So we have about 180 plus own models that we built and run in our proprietary platform called Cat Server. We have an own exposure data format where all the data is stored in one place, in one database. It's highly standardized, integrated modeling process. We have a number of applications consuming our CAT modeling services. So it's an API-first setup, which allows a lot of other applications in the company or services to access our CAT modeling capabilities. Why do we integrate Oasis? So with Oasis, we can provide our users a variety of alternative risk views. So it gives us an easy way to get access to alternative risk views, not just ours. But we only must invest once to integrate the Oasis kernel. And then we can add additional models quite easily. On OED, ORD, we see them as an independent exchange standard, and that will reduce complexity and dependencies. So we see it as a strategic investment. We invest quite a bit. So we are just about to release the first version of the OED importer into our platform. And we thought we're going to show you actually not what we do, not just what we do, but actually that it also works. Before I show you the video with the recording, because a live demo was a bit risky, or probably also a bit tricky to set up in this environment here. Just give you an idea, this is our Cat Server environment. So we have does the laser work? Ah, it does. That's the environment. We have a central exposure data storage. Whatever comes in from whatever source goes into one central database. We have a number of model kernels, actually 3 model kernels that we run, so more older or newer model kernels, some legacy models that are still around, and of course a central data storage for the result data. And then we have interfaces to get the data in, interfaces to get the data out, to downstream systems like pricing tools, portfolio steering tools, central reporting, etc. And what you see on top, as I mentioned before, a number of end-user applications that digest these CAT modeling services. And so, simply said, it's an easy thing. We just add a 4th kernel, the Oasis kernel. Of course, we need to transform the data to OED to feed the model, and then it says ORD, it's not officially there yet, get the result data back into our storage. But that's what we are working on, or what we have live now. And if the video starts, I'm going to show you how this works. So it's a demo from our, there we go, demo from our, it's called Multisnap. It's our main front end. You see that's how it looks like. I can say import the portfolio from an easy file. That's our internal Excel tool, the simple one. It's an Australia demo, as you can see. I choose input geocode rate, so everything in one go. To say use the Oasis model, because they are not our main view of risk, I have to choose a so-called product code, and then hit apply, finish, and the rating task is now processed. I skipped a bit, so it took a couple minutes to run, but now I can look at the portfolio itself. This card represents the portfolio, get some info about it, can check on the quality of the data, what perils are covered by that portfolio. In this case, I have my result set. I could have multiple result sets, actually. And again, some quality checks. There's a little glitch with the 0 we haven't fixed yet. But you see it's some exposure in Australia. We switch to the loss details, and that's now actually, you see, it's Oasis, KM21 is our order kernel, so we have Oasis and our other models kind of go nicely together, and you can run them in one go. You don't have to care about, do I want to use Oasis or not? And yeah, as a quick demo, you can do a layer calculation in here, etc. Or off you go to a next tool that is then doing the pricing, actually. So that was the quick demo. You see the layer numbers here, results, all available now. So the thank you is just for the video. There's 2 more slides. So the current status, we have Oasis models available. We are using them as a second opinion only. None of our primary risk views is based on Oasis or on Oasis model. They run on dedicated VMs, so that's more a bit technical. So for every model we have, we set up a separate virtual machine, and the platform accesses it. Everything runs on Microsoft Azure on the cloud. Very standardized processes. If you want to add another model, we just add another machine with the setup. Translation of our SX Plus exposure format to OED is implemented. Comes with some tricks. Talk about it later. But we can look at a combined result, as I showed you. Everything in one go. Challenges, performance and scalability, still limited, and that's what Beat mentioned before on the enterprise, or Oasis at scale it's called sometimes. That's something we are also investing in the development and expect next year. That will then help to really scale out and make use of cloud computing capabilities. OED OED actually supports a bit more than Oasis can digest, so that's one of the issues. Account level conditions are not yet considered in the kernel. That's some work going on there. When it comes to georeference data, whether you support zip codes or counties, etc., also there not quite standardized as we would like it if we want to run global portfolios. OED is still in CSV format, which becomes an issue if you have large portfolios, millions of locations. So Parquet is in the pipeline as an additional format, file format. And yeah, we have a couple of workarounds on the result side to do the grouping of results, or post-processing, etc. And also in discussion with Oasis on that. What are we working on? Beat mentioned we are actively participating. Actually, Beat is a member of the board. We are a member of the technical steering group for Oasis, for ODS, IDF members. We actively actually interact with the Oasis team, the development team, and at that moment, a big thank for the good interaction, and also call to the community, talk to them, share your ideas. The collaboration with GEM, Beat mentioned, we are participating in the Aeon OED pilot that's going on. And we're going to continue to integrate the Oasis kernel, so when we have the scalability capabilities, etc. We are also exploring and implementing additional features on our side, where we say the Oasis kernel is not yet there where we want it, and we're also looking into how we can then share this with the community in an open source spirit. And we're working on the development of a hybrid approach for our model development. So we want to make use of GEM, Oasis capabilities, but also our ways how we develop models. So again, GEM collaboration is an example. And some of you know, for example, CatNet, or so external solutions that we offer clients. There's always the question, how do you get the data in simple Excel format? Not everybody has an EDM at hand. So OED should become the standard to get data into our application. That was the quick run-through. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to have the next speaker in a slightly different order, as you all will understand. So we're going to have Nick Moody, who we think is mostly going to be on audio, but possibly also on video. We're not quite sure. But as long as we can hear him, that's all that really matters. And Nick is going to talk about some of the Insurance Development Forum's strategy and how it relates to Oasis, I think. Nick, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Dickie. Can you hear and see me?
We can hear and see you almost perfectly. So, Nick, Over to you.
Okay, great. Well, I am very pleased to be talking to you this afternoon, and so sorry not to be in Zurich. And also, so is Ian Brannigan, the character you can see to the left on this slide, who is the co-chair of the risk modelling steering group of the Insurance Development Forum. I think probably many of you in this conference will know Ian. You may be less familiar perhaps with Jenty Kirschwood, who is also co-chair, and she is the head of section of Global Risk Assessment and Reporting in UNDRR. So the Risk Modelling Steering Group is a group of truly cross-sector organisations. We have about 60, actually heading for 70 organisations, drawn from reinsurance, insurance, from the risk modelling community, from the vendor modelling community, I should say, but also, for example, humanitarians, academics, and technical organisations, research organisations such as GEM. The report on the right, which is overlaid over a picture of a suburb of Manila, is one of our more recent publications, and I'm going to refer back to that later. There's a lot in there that elaborates on some of the things I'm going to say right now. Next slide, please. A quick word on the IDF. I know many of you will be very familiar with the IDF, but and many of you will be in companies that are member organisations. No need to look at this in detail. The headline red numbers really convey the message. So the Insurance Development Forum is there to provide a portal for private sector capability and resources to development challenges and what's known in the development world as the 2030 global agenda. So this is all around the sustainable development goals. It's around formally the Paris Agreement and other agreements relating to climate and disaster risk, particularly Sendai. Informally as well, the agenda, certainly in the development world, is around climate justice and the imbalance of resources across the planet in terms of being able to deal with climate change. The insurance community, through the IDF, has committed 5 billion in underwriting capacity to help tackle this challenge, and it has signed up to the INSU resilience goal of covering 500 million people against climate and disaster shock by 2025. In order to do that, they are working with UNDP and with the German government on something called the Tripartite Agreement, which is a program to work with 20 of the most climate-exposed countries. And that's about putting frameworks, not only risk transfer frameworks, but also risk knowledge frameworks in place to help those countries better deal with the risk. Next slide, please. So within the Insurance Development Forum, there are a number of working groups, and I'm speaking to you on behalf of the Risk Modelling Steering Group, RMSG. And we have really just one major strategy, which is to accelerate risk understanding where it is needed the most. And why would we do that? It's because everyone wins. So this is about risk understanding as applied right across the spectrum, not just simply to contingency risk finance, but also to finance for disaster risk reduction, and also potentially as well in the humanitarian sector for finance for anticipatory action, and indeed applying the same principles of risk understanding for disaster risk management as well, which doesn't necessarily imply the financial component. Why would the private sector be interested? Why would the IDF be there? Well, as I said, everybody wins, and if the private sector's job is about bringing capital to risk, well, so that is also the job of the wider development and humanitarian communities. We don't solve climate and disaster risk problems without the movement of finance. But in terms of the benefit to the private sector, it's not just about doing the right thing. It's also the case that if you have a better and more equal understanding of risk in emerging markets, and a greater fluency, if you like, in the language of risk, and particularly financial, in terms of financial metrics, then you're going to have a better and more equal conversation when it comes to attracting capital and crowding in private sector finance, whether that's on the investment side or whether it's on the risk transfer side. So it's all about creating those conversations and about creating more local capacity and capability in the more vulnerable countries, and there is a big appetite for it. So the strategy breaks up in the risk modeling steering group into two major components. One is around delivering content and capability, and I'll come back to that in a couple of slides' time. And the other is about enabling technology, and that's really the most relevant part of the strategy to this conference. We knew fairly early on that what we did was to have an infrastructure, an ecosystem, if you like, of risk modeling that is open source, that addresses problems of cost for a start, that is capable of driving the kind of behaviors we wanted to see. So this isn't about the technology, but it's about users being able to share models. It's about connecting departments and research establishments and the private sector across where they're actually able to exchange data and models on the same platform. It's around transparency. It's around being able to see the assumptions in the models. And it's about having the capacity not only to look at global models on the platform, but also to integrate your local research. The way to do that, of course, is through a set of common standards, which is why in the strategy, in the risk modeling steering group strategy, we've actually been able to put some money and some effort behind working on developing a bridge between the private sector and the public sector on open data standards. And given everything that I just mentioned, the kind of obvious choice for us to go to support this strategy was to adopt Oasis and to lead with that in our conversations with the public sector and with the humanitarian sector. There is now work going on that is to bridge, is to create this bridge across from the private sector to the public sector on data standards. But we also have to treat the world as it is, which means building interoperability between existing models as well. And there's a lot of work going on there, which I'll come back to. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another way of looking at this is just looking at the top half of this slide here, is that what you might describe as our clients or our country partners are on a journey. They will all have a different level of technical understanding, a different level of resource, and they'll all be at different places along this journey. And we're building quite a detailed framework behind these kind of three round icons at the top here. But at the very top level, we see that some countries are actually would actually benefit from starting out with a risk audit and a good look at what should their strategic priorities be for disaster risk reduction, as well as where might it make more sense to transfer residual risk and so on. And for that, you need globally consistent models, a relatively low resolution view, but what you need to be able to do is compare risks on a like-for-like basis. We would then move with countries through to more operational levels, looking at parametric instruments, for example, or operational adaptation projects, and as I mentioned earlier, disaster risk management projects. And then at the far end of your journey, you get into much more complex risk transfer transactions that most of you in this audience are probably engaged with, where you actually do need a detailed understanding of catastrophe risk modeling. Now, to help countries on that journey, what we have chosen to do is bring together, or what we've suggested to the public sector, is a partnership in something called the Global Risk Modeling Alliance. And that would have three major components to it that would help countries through this journey. There is a knowledge transfer piece for sure, and we propose a team of expert practitioners that are drawn from both private sector and public sector to work on a co-definition and co-development basis with countries. There is a content element where we actually need the public sector to provide some funding to help fill the model and data gaps, but recognizing that there's already just a wealth of content out there that is appropriate for countries, but not necessarily yet accessible. And you can see on the left there, for example, reference to Climada, reference to some other global models. GEM would be a good example, and also to a proposal that we're making called the Global Resilience Index, which any time at the end of this talk to go into, but I'd be very happy to answer questions about, and you're certainly going to hear more about it fairly shortly. And then the third element, if you like, the third pillar of this proposal is the infrastructure piece. Could I go to the next slide, please? So let's just focus in on that infrastructure piece, because that's where the IDF is really putting some effort in. We were glad to have signed memoranda of understanding with 8 companies, 8 member organizations of the steering committee of the IDF, who put in money to develop Oasis in aspects that were going to be useful for public sector use cases and also humanitarian use cases. Most of you will be aware that there was a big push in the last year, certainly the first part of this year, towards performance improvements in Oasis and also strengthening the code base, building a lot of the code in Python. And the IDF actually made a contribution to that. That was actually a wider industry effort, but there was certainly a contribution financially and in-kind support from members of the IDF in making that happen. We're now moving from that phase, if you like, to phase 2 of the IDF's contribution to Oasis development, where we're proposing a 12-month development project specifically targeted at public sector use cases. One of those where we're working with countries that is clearly going to be a priority is the development of parametric instruments. And we've identified in a workshop recently scope for a potential entry-level tool that follows the standard structure, if you like, of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, but also has an actuarial engine underneath it that makes it capable of financial transactions without it necessarily being as complex as full catastrophe risk models. We're looking at that being part of our development program, but also developing tools and frameworks around that help us to share knowledge of risk modeling with countries, and some other developments around, for example, better access to metadata around models. So there's quite a lot of thought that's going into this, and we will shortly be preparing for the Oasis board and for the IDF board a proposal, a project initiation document to get that work underway. But we think it's quite an exciting time. And this entry-level tool, it may or may not end up actually in the Oasis ecosystem. We think there are a lot of good arguments for why it should, but whatever it is, whatever it ends up as, it certainly should be compatible with Oasis. So companies have committed already the first year of funds to help make this happen, and will, assuming that we are able to secure public sector support for all of this work, and I'll be describing more of that in a second, then there will be a year 2 and a year 3 contribution as well under those memorandum of understanding that I just mentioned. Next slide, please. So that was the infrastructure piece. And as I mentioned, it's all about the platform, the standards, and interoperability. But I also mentioned the other half of RMSG's strategy, which is around capability building and content. And I've mentioned this entity, the Global Risk Modeling Alliance. There is also this thing called the Global Resilience Index, which is not actually an IDF strategy on its own. We're actually collaborating with a number of other organizations right across sectors, including, for example, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, that was it, and some other organizations, including, for example, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. The idea here is, for those of you who are familiar with the Global Assessment Report from the UN in 2017, GAR-17 for short, is that it provides a globally consistent set of resilience metrics, but unlike GAR-17, it's capable of user interaction and actually running scenarios for future warming pathways. So lots more on that to follow. I don't think there's going to be time in this presentation to take you through the slides on that. But there is quite a lot going on there that will be announced at COP26 and will, of course, be available or will actually depend on the Oasis platform for getting out there and getting countries to engage with it. There is other project work going on. where Oasis is central, and I'll just point to the START financing facility as an example. This is if you like, a donor risk pool in the humanitarian world that operates on the principle, on basically insurance type thinking, and will indeed at some stage be passing an excess of risk layer onto the private sector. So Oasis, again, is central to that whole conversation that we're having developing the START financing facility, and we certainly see many more humanitarian use cases going forward. Next slide, please. So in our conversation with the public sector, and particularly, well, on both the demand side and on the donor side, we are talking about these three pillars. I've talked about the infrastructure, which is the top right there. I've talked about the team, if you like, the entity, the Global Risk Modelling Alliance entity of public and private technical practitioners at the bottom there. And I've talked a little bit about the top left there. But this is the proposal that we've been taking to the public sector. And as I mentioned, if you'd like to look into the background behind any of this paragraph at the bottom there about the DERA report, the Development Impact of Risk Analytics report, takes you basically through all the logic behind this with a lot of evidence and a lot of case studies in a lot more detail. But the key thing is that it is dependent on public-private partnership in delivery. Next slide, please. So what about that public-private partnership? Well, I've already mentioned the private sector support that's going into this. On the public sector side, we've made huge progress just this year on the demand side with the V20 group. You may not be familiar with that group, but that is a group of finance ministers from, strangely, 48 countries of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, who are less well equipped necessarily to deal with the risk and would like, we know from feedback from them, to develop their own risk analytics capability and to develop that more equal position in conversation with markets. We've got to the stage now where that group of finance ministers wish to sign an agreement with the IDF for this program, the Global Risk Modelling Alliance, and wish to make their views known to the G20 group and the G7 governments in particular, that they would like the public sector international development programs from G7 governments to join this effort and fund the modelling that I mentioned earlier. So it's all very positive. We're looking at potentially an announcement at COP26, and prior to that, we have a joint meeting, a round table, which is chaired by Mark Carney and also Denis Duverne, the chair of the IDF, in the margins of the UN General Assembly, actually later this month, on exactly this topic, which will cover both the Global Risk Modelling Alliance and the Global Resilience Index. So I think I've probably used up more than my time, and it's probably best to stop there. There are a couple of slides later in this pack, if you could just go down one, on the Global Resilience Index. What I imagine will happen is that we'll circulate these slides afterwards and you'll be able to look at this one and the next slide in more detail. I'd be very happy to answer questions. I assume potentially there's not time now, although Dickie, you might tell me otherwise. But otherwise, Dickie has my contact details, and I'd be very happy to talk further about any or all of this. Many thanks.
Thank you, Nick, very much for making some time. Actually, bizarrely, there is time. I don't know why I never had that at a conference before. And look, I want to make a couple of points. So, I mean, I hope it's obvious that actually why this really matters from a practical perspective, ignoring any moral feelings we might have about what this does, is that the embedding of standards and the incorporation of interoperability, it matters for all of us that we're using common standards and that the tools that we're using are able to communicate as seamlessly and easily as possible. And the wider the community that shares that ability, the more efficient we can all be and the better we can interact around the world as well, whether for moral issues, which of course is important, or possibly even just for practical issues like the countries that Nick and others in the IDF are working in are ones that form the basis of new business and new opportunities in understanding risk too. And Oasis has worked very heavily with Bangladesh and the Philippines over the last 3 years, and through the IDF and some of the team that work with Nick, there's also been work in Indonesia and Sri Lanka, now Kenya we were talking about this morning, and so this is extending further outwards. So I think that's only good news for us. But has anybody got any questions in the room or online? Happy to take one or two before we move to the next session, if you'd like. Question at the front. Your microphone is going to be coming towards you, which will probably be easier than...
Nick, thanks for navigating us through all these organizations you're kind of orchestrating here. I'm quite impressed at all these abbreviations and names. Wondering, kind of getting to the Oasis piece of that, what real assets are already tangible in this environment? Or is there some, let's say, Bangladesh was just mentioned by Dickie, is there models already available or hazards, risk insights, which become part of that shareable pool?
Yeah, that's a great question. And well, actually, I would just point to those projects that Dickie just mentioned as real tangible proof that the principles that we're talking about here really do work. And Dickie can expand on that because it was his organization that actually led those projects. But my observation is, having observed the closing of the project in Philippines, in other words, the release of the project in the Philippines and again in more recently in Bangladesh, is that it's very powerful in connecting completely different types of organizations that would not otherwise have connected. And to see the closing workshops where you had, for example, the really enthusiastic disaster risk manager from the Central Business District of Manila, in the same conversation with the engineers from the University of Philippines who had delivered the high quality LiDAR data, and the same conversation as the national reinsurer, and the same conversation as the hydromet agency, Pagasa, all using the same content on Oasis. I think that's enormously powerful. And that really goes back to my point that I was trying to make at the outset, which is it's not about the technology, it's about the behaviors that this can drive. Dickie, I don't know if you wish to comment further on the deliverables from those projects.
Well, I think the only thing I would add is to your question, Martin, is that actually, Nick and I went to a meeting in South Africa 18 months ago where the question from the insurance industry in Africa was, can we get flood models that incorporate climate change? Because that seems such a hard thing to do. And so Nick and I were sort of pretty much, I think, one of the few people with sort of insurance and modeling backgrounds. We were able to say, actually, yes, we could do it, and you could have the first one delivered in 3 months if you like, and we could do the whole of Africa within a year, depending on how quickly you want to do it. So these things are really, really possible. Now, there are different models, business models, that are available to enable these things. And actually, as Nick has mentioned, and I had a conversation earlier on here too, that what we're now trying to do is, I think, two key things that are really important. So one is, there are sometimes two levels of conversation that go on. One that starts maybe with a sort of what's happened in my country, in my region, to my crops in the last few years, and what does that tell me about my risk, and what does that tell me about my ways of mitigating or transferring that risk. And maybe more sophisticated conversations that starts with the Ministry of Finance, where they want to see YLTs, they want to see standardized CAT model output, they want some independence, they don't want the model they're using to be not usable in 12 months' time because of restrictive licensing agreements, and they like the idea of local academics being part of the development of this. So what Nick mentioned earlier is we're trying to both put those two things together a little bit so we can have a more coherent conversation at a local level around the world. But also trying to see whether or not we can actually standardize how we think about this risk, not because there's only one way of thinking about risk, but because if we start with some ways of thinking about risk, we can then diversify later on and we can be much more efficient. And I think there's some complexity there that means that this is never going to be an easy thing to do. But we're really beginning, and the things that have been out, that hopefully will be announced at COP this year, the really serious involvement from the V20, some central governments in Europe being behind this, you can sort of see there's almost a tangible ability to really drive some of this stuff further forward that will have a very direct impact on how the insurance and reinsurance industry also is part of that, a very important part of that sort of journey and that story. So we're not there yet. You have to be an optimist to be in this space, to want to see it come to some fruition, because there's lots of challenges, but I think we're making progress. So I think, unless I see any other urgent questions online or other, we're pretty much on time. Nick, thank you again so much for making some time from Spain. Safe travels. Don't like the look of your tan. That's not fair when we've had a miserable weather in most of Northern Europe. But anyway, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.